The marble halls of Rome whispered with rumors more dangerous than daggers. Behind the gilded doors of imperial palaces, the most powerful men in the world blurred the line between law and lust, between statecraft and seduction. To serve in their courts was not just a political risk. It could mean sacrificing your body, your family, or your very dignity to an emperor whose desires were absolute. Imagine being summoned late at night to the Palatine Hill. The torches flicker, guards drag you forward, and the command is clear. Surrender your wife, your daughter, perhaps even yourself, to the emperor's bed, or risk treason. This was no metaphor. For rulers like Caligula, Elagabalus, and Nero, desire itself was not a private indulgence. It was policy, written into the daily governance of the empire. What they wanted, Rome was forced to endure. The Roman Empire was already a place of extremes. Gladiators bled for entertainment, slaves were treated as disposable flesh, and conquest fed the appetite of emperors who styled themselves as gods. Yet even in this brutal world, there were taboos, boundaries of sex, religion, and family that even the most jaded Roman citizen recognized. Incest between siblings, a Vestal virgin breaking her sacred vow of chastity, an emperor marrying a castrated boy. These were not just sins. They were abominations that mocked Rome's traditions and angered the gods. And yet, these very taboos became law under emperors drunk with power. Caligula is said to have dragged noblewomen from banquets to his chambers, turning the Senate's wives into playthings. Elagabalus went further, marrying a Vestal virgin and importing his own cult of sexualized sun worship, forcing Rome to bow to his private rituals. Nero staged weddings with men and paraded his own perverse fantasies as state ceremonies. To the common people, these stories arrived as scandalous whispers, satire carved in graffiti on city walls, and gossip carried through taverns. But for senators and nobles, they were lived reality. Their families were dragged into the emperor's orbit, their honor traded for survival. And at times, resistance was impossible. To deny the emperor's lust was to invite death. The stakes were cosmic as well as personal. In the Roman worldview, morality was tied to divine favor. When emperors desecrated Rome's sacred customs, citizens believed disaster would follow. Plague, famine, military defeat, and sometimes those disasters did come, reinforcing the fear that unchecked imperial desire was more than scandal. It was a curse on the empire itself. This is not a story of love or passion. It is a story of domination, humiliation, and taboo elevated to the highest throne. Across the empire's history, emperors turned their forbidden cravings into law, reshaping Rome in their own image of corruption. Their reigns would shock their contemporaries, topple dynasties, and ultimately set the stage for Rome's moral collapse. But the true horror lies not in what they desired, but in what they could command. For when the emperor's lust became law, no citizen, noble or slave, was safe. And this is only the beginning. Because the most shocking revelations of Rome's forbidden emperors are still to come. In Rome, desire was never just private. It was a weapon, sharpened and wielded by those who ruled. Where a modern ruler might draft laws or levy taxes, emperors and kings of the ancient world learned to rule not only through armies and gold, but through the most intimate currency of all, the human body. Sex was power, and intimacy was domination. For the emperor, every conquest of the flesh was a conquest of loyalty. To possess another man's wife, to violate the vows of a priestess, to command a noblewoman into his bed, these were not simply indulgences. They were acts of political theater. Each one was a reminder. Nothing in Rome was sacred but the emperor's will. The Roman elite understood this language well. Mistresses, concubines, and favored boys were tokens of influence. A senator might offer his daughter to secure favor just as easily as he might offer tribute of land or coin. to be chosen, for the emperor's bed was simultaneously an honor and a humiliation. Survival often depended on submission, but power through desire was not unique to Rome. Across the ancient and medieval world, rulers blurred the line between intimacy and authority. In Persia, harems were not merely centers of pleasure, but engines of political intrigue, where rival queens and concubines maneuvered for succession. In Viking societies, marriages were tools of alliance, and sexual rituals tied warriors to their gods. Even in medieval courts, a royal mistress could wield more influence than a council of advisors. Still, Rome elevated this dynamic to its highest expression, because in the Roman world, sexuality was already a theater of contradictions. On one hand, male dominance and public displays of virility were celebrated. On the other, taboos still lingered: incest, priestly chastity, and the sanctity of marriage vows. To violate these boundaries was to defy both society and the gods. And when emperors turned those very taboos into personal privileges, the entire empire was forced to watch. Psychologically, the message was devastating. Desire became a method of control. By forcing the powerful into acts that shamed them, the emperor broke their spirit. A senator who had surrendered his wife could never raise his voice in opposition. His dishonor chained him to the throne. Even religion was not safe. When Elagabalus married a Vestal virgin, it was not only an act of lust, but a declaration that Rome's most sacred institution existed to serve him. For the common people, these stories blurred into rumor and satire, but their impact was real. Ordinary Romans could be punished for breaking taboos that emperors themselves flaunted. A slave who defied sexual demands faced torture or execution, while the emperor's perversions were celebrated as divine privilege. The double standard was clear. What was forbidden for all others became law when performed by the ruler. And yet, for all the horror, there was fascination. Desire was a spectacle. Scandalous tales drew crowds, just as gladiators did. The emperor's bedroom became a stage upon which the empire projected its own anxieties about power, morality, and corruption. Because in the ancient world, control was never absolute until it reached the most intimate spaces. When the emperor claimed mastery over desire itself, he claimed mastery over Rome. But soon, one scandal would shatter the illusion of imperial control and plunge Rome into a nightmare that even its gods could not forgive. It is one thing for a ruler to indulge in private sins. It is another to turn those sins into spectacles of power. And no emperor embodied this descent into scandal more vividly than Gaius Julius. Caesar Augustus Germanicus, better known by the nickname whispered with both awe and terror, Caligula. When Caligula inherited the throne in 37 CE, Rome expected a savior. The young emperor was the son of the beloved general Germanicus, the Golden, child of the empire. At first, his reign promised hope. He lowered taxes, freed unjustly imprisoned citizens, and staged grand spectacles for the people. Rome cheered, but soon, whispers began. Something inside the emperor was breaking. Whether it was madness from illness, the intoxication of absolute power, or a darker cruelty within him all along, Caligula began to reveal a reign of scandal that would sear itself into Roman memory. The chambers of the Palatine Hill transformed into something more akin to a brothel than a palace. At banquets, Caligula would recline like a god, while noble senators and their wives were summoned before him. Ancient historians tell us he would drag the women away, sometimes in front of their husbands, sometimes disappearing with them into curtained alcoves. When he returned, he mocked the men openly, describing in graphic detail what he had done to their wives. These were not merely acts of lust, they were acts of humiliation, political tools that left Rome's elite powerless and disgraced. But Caligula's appetites went further. He allegedly turned parts of the imperial palace into a public brothel, staffed with the wives of senators and noblewomen, who were forced to prostitute themselves for the emperor's profit and amusement. The Senate, once the proud backbone of Rome now saw its daughters and wives degraded, reduced to tokens in Caligula's theatre of control. For the emperor, their shame was his entertainment. Even within his own family, no boundary held. Caligula's infamous intimacy with his sisters, most notably Drusilla, shocked Rome to its core. Rumors claimed he treated Drusilla as a consort, flaunting her in public as though she were an empress, and even deifying her after her death. To Romans, incest was the ultimate violation, a crime against both human law and divine order. That their emperor could flaunt it openly left many believing the gods themselves would strike Rome down. The human cost was staggering. Nobles lived in constant fear, knowing that their family honor could be destroyed in a single night. Ordinary citizens too were not spared. Caligula demanded the daughters of commoners for his own pleasure, sometimes in exchange for favors, sometimes simply because he could. Resistance was impossible. Because the true nightmare was not simply what Caligula did in private, but how his private lusts tore through the very fabric of Rome itself. If Caligula's reign was a carnival of humiliation, then the rule of Elagabalus, the teenage emperor, from the Syrian frontier was something darker still. The collision of politics, religion, and sexuality in a spectacle that even Rome, decadent as it was, could barely stomach. Born Varius Avitus Bassianus, Elagabalus rose to power at only 14, elevated by his grandmother's machinations. Rome expected a pliant boy emperor, a figurehead to be guided by elder statesmen. Instead, what they received was a youth consumed by his own obsessions. At the heart of his rule was the worship of a foreign god, the Syrian sun deity Elagabal, from whom he took his imperial name. For him, religion and sexuality fused into a single theatre of scandal. One of his most shocking acts was his marriage to a Vestal virgin, a priestess sworn to 30 years of chastity, a living symbol of Rome's purity. By wedding her, Elagabalus did not just violate tradition, he desecrated the very soul of Roman religion. Citizens whispered that the empire would be cursed, that Rome's gods would abandon them for this blasphemy. But to Elagabalus, the marriage was a declaration of power. Even the sacred vows of the Vestals bent to his desire. His palace became an extension of his temple. Elagabalus imported priests from Syria, forced senators to attend strange rituals, and allegedly staged sacred orgies in which he played both priest and deity. Some sources describe him dressing in women's clothing, painting his eyes, and presenting himself as a bride to his lovers. Others whisper of darker pursuits, that he offered vast sums to physicians who could transform his body into that of a woman. Whether truth or rumor, the effect was the same. Rome's elite watched their emperor dissolve the boundaries of gender, religion, and law in ways that left them both scandalized and fearful. But these acts were not private eccentricities. They were political weapons. By redefining Rome's religion around his foreign cult, Elagabalus sought to shift power from the Senate to himself. Every ritual, every scandalous act, was a reminder that the empire no longer bowed to Jupiter or Mars. It bowed to the emperor's god, and by extension, to his desire. The Senate seethed. Many of Rome's old families saw in Elagabalus not just decadence, but an existential threat. If the emperor could rewrite the sacred order of Rome, then what traditions could survive? Political intrigue sharpened in the shadows, daggers whispered in the night. Behind the marble columns of the Senate House, the boy emperor's lusts became a rallying cry for his enemies. Ultimately, it was his own excess that doomed him. His open mockery of Roman tradition, his scandalous marriages, and his alienating of the elite left him surrounded by enemies. In 222 CE, soldiers of the Praetorian Guard, tired of his excess, pressured by his grandmother, and enraged by his disregard for Roman custom, turned on him. The boy who made his desires into Rome's laws was dragged through the streets, slaughtered, and thrown into the Tiber like refuse. Elagabalus's reign revealed the terrifying truth that sexuality, when wielded as political theatre, could both elevate and destroy an emperor, but the story of emperors who turned desire into law did not end with Elagabalus. Another would rise, one who blurred the boundaries of gender, marriage, and spectacle even further, and his name was Nero. The scandals of emperors like Caligula and Elagabalus did not exist in isolation. They spilled into the streets of Rome, seeping into the daily lives of both noble and common citizens. For while the palace shimmered with gold and perversion, the people of Rome were forced to live in its shadow, bearing the cultural fallout of imperial desire turned law. To the average citizen, stories of imperial excess arrived in fragments: a whisper from a servant, satire recited in taverns, or crude graffiti etched onto crumbling walls. The emperor's bedroom became public gossip, transformed into dark comedy. But behind the laughter was unease. In a world where religion governed morality, every broken taboo was believed to carry divine consequences. When Elagabalus married a Vestal virgin, farmers feared poor harvests. When Caligula paraded his incestuous relationships, mothers whispered that the gods might curse their children. Rome was a city that thrived on spectacle, but these spectacles felt like omens. Marriage for ordinary Romans was a social contract, often arranged for family honor or financial stability. Fidelity was expected, at least in principle, especially from women. But while common citizens risked exile, imprisonment, or even execution for adultery, the emperor flaunted every taboo without consequence. This double standard deepened resentment. Slavery, too, played a central role. For the elite, slaves were not only laborers, but instruments of sexual desire. An emperor's pleasure palace required a constant flow of bodies, willing or not. While Roman law technically protected citizens from such abuse, slaves had no such defense. Their lives were at the mercy of their masters, and in the emperor's palace, their suffering was hidden behind velvet curtains. What emperors indulged in freely, others paid dearly for. A Vestal virgin accused of breaking her vow faced live burial, a brutal punishment designed to preserve the goddess Vesta's honor. Yet Elagabalus could wed a Vestal with impunity. A common man accused of incest might be executed. Caligula was worshipped by some as a living god, despite his rumored acts with his sisters. These contradictions poisoned the moral fabric of Rome, sending a clear message. There were two laws, one for the ruler, another for the ruled. For women of the imperial household, scandal was both a curse and an opportunity. Figures like Messalina, the wife of Emperor Claudius, became infamous for her alleged debaucheries, wielding sexuality as a weapon within the palace. Noble women might be forced into the emperor's bed, but some leveraged these encounters to gain influence, protect their families, or destroy rivals. For the common woman, however, survival meant silence. For ordinary Romans, these imperial scandals were not distant entertainment. They filtered into law, religion, and the fragile sense of order that held the empire together. If the emperor mocked Rome's taboos, why should citizens respect them? If the ruler himself lived as though the gods were powerless, how long before the gods struck all of Rome in vengeance? In time, these contradictions built pressure, creating a dangerous tension between spectacle and survival. Because, while the people could tolerate scandal, there always came a moment when the emperor's desire went too far, when one act of perversion pushed the empire beyond its breaking point. That turning point was coming, and it would arrive with an emperor who turned his fantasies into marriages, ceremonies, and grotesque theatre, Nero. For decades, Rome had endured scandal. Caligula humiliated the Senate. Elagabalus desecrated religion. But there was still one emperor whose excesses would drive Rome to its breaking point: Nero. If Caligula turned his palace into a brothel, and Elagabalus into a temple of blasphemy, Nero transformed the empire itself into a stage for his fantasies, blurring theatre, marriage, and obscenity in ways no Roman could ignore. Among Nero's most grotesque acts was his obsession with a young slave named Sporus. Ancient sources tell us that Nero, captivated by the boy's resemblance to his deceased wife Poppaea, ordered him castrated. This mutilation was not hidden in shame. It was celebrated as statecraft. Nero married Sporus in a lavish public ceremony, dressing him as an empress and parading him through the streets as his bride. Senators, generals, and the Roman people were forced to attend, as though this perverse union were as sacred as the marriage of Jupiter and Juno. To Romans, this was not only scandalous, it was cosmic mockery. Marriage was the foundation of Roman society, tied to inheritance, family, honor, and divine favor. For the emperor to rewrite it into a theater of lust was to desecrate both human law and divine order. But Nero did not stop there. In other accounts, he reversed the roles, wedding himself to a freedman named Pythagoras. This time, Nero donned the bridal veil, submitting in public ceremony as the wife. The emperor of the greatest empire on earth stood before Rome, not as ruler, but as spectacle, performing his desire as law. What was once forbidden was now celebrated as official ritual. Nero's excesses blurred reality and fantasy. Some ancient writers claimed he staged mock pregnancies, behaving as though he himself could bear children. In a society where masculinity was synonymous with power, Nero's theatrics shocked even the most jaded citizens. His every act twisted Rome's values into grotesque parody. And yet, Nero believed himself untouchable. To him, desire was not weakness, it was empire. If he wished to marry a boy, Rome would applaud. If he chose to dress as a bride, the Senate would bless the union. He did not rule as emperor alone. He ruled as playwright, forcing the empire into his twisted drama. But theater has an audience, and audiences can turn. For the Roman elite, Nero's marriages were not merely scandal, they were humiliation. Every forced attendance at his ceremonies was a reminder of their subjugation. Every whisper of mockery in the streets chipped away at his image. The people who once cheered his spectacles now murmured discontent. The turning point came when Rome itself began to burn. In 64 CE, a fire consumed the city. Whether Nero caused it or not, his decision to stage performances while the capital smoldered sealed his fate. Whispers of divine punishment grew louder. Senators conspired. The Praetorian Guard turned. For all his theater, Nero could not escape reality. Declared a public enemy, abandoned by his guards, he fled into hiding. Surrounded by whispers of betrayal, he ended his own life with the words, "What an artist dies in me." Nero's reign marked the point where imperial desire could no longer be indulged as spectacle. His marriages, his humiliations, his mockeries of religion and law, they revealed a truth Rome could no longer bear, that when an emperor's fantasies become Rome's reality, the empire itself collapses into farce. And the consequences of these scandals would echo for centuries, reshaping Rome's identity and paving the way for a moral revolution that would transform the ancient world. The scandals of Rome's most notorious emperors did not die with them. Their excesses, Caligula's humiliations, Elagabalus's blasphemies, Nero's grotesque theater, left scars across the empire's culture, politics, and even its spiritual destiny. When emperors turned desire into law, they reshaped not only the empire of their own day, but also the moral world that would follow. The immediate consequence was instability. Caligula's debauchery shattered the Senate's dignity and invited daggers into his chambers. Elagabalus's desecration of religion provoked the Praetorian Guard into open revolt. Nero's theatrics and neglect of Rome during its Great Fire broke the bond between emperor and people. Each scandal ended not in quiet death, but in violent assassination, rebellion, or disgrace. The empire learned a dangerous lesson. When emperors made their desires the law, their reigns became short, bloody, and remembered with horror. But the damage did not stop at politics. These scandals corroded Rome's moral fabric. Citizens saw that the laws binding them, marriage contracts, vows of chastity, punishments for adultery, were meaningless when the emperor himself spat upon them. the double standard undermined, the very concept of Roman order. Outrage grew not only against individual emperors, but against the system that allowed one man to indulge without consequence, while the masses suffered under strict moral codes. This cultural disillusionment set the stage for rebellion of a different kind, not merely political, but spiritual. In the centuries that followed, Rome would increasingly turn to new systems of morality. Chief among them was Christianity, a religion that directly condemned many of the excesses Rome had tolerated. Where the emperors flaunted incest, adultery, and ritual debauchery, Christianity preached chastity, fidelity, and humility. Where emperors wielded sexuality as power, Christianity redefined it as sacred within marriage alone. For many Romans, weary of scandal, this new moral order was not a burden, but a relief. Christianity offered certainty where imperial debauchery had sown chaos. It promised divine justice against rulers who once seemed untouchable. In time, it became more than a religion. It became the ideological weapon that would overthrow the empire's old gods and reshape Europe's future. Even centuries later, the memory of these emperors haunted Rome. Medieval chroniclers repeated the tales of Caligula, Elagabalus, and Nero as warnings against unchecked lust and power. Their names became synonyms for tyranny, perversion, and divine punishment. To this day, the phrase "fiddling while Rome burns" evokes Nero's legacy of self-indulgence amid disaster. Archaeology has only deepened these echoes. Frescoes of decadent banquets, inscriptions mocking emperors, and ruins of imperial palaces remind us that these scandals were not mere legends. They lived in reality, scars etched into Rome's stones as much as its stories. Ultimately, the forbidden practices of Rome's emperors reshaped civilization itself. Their excesses pushed the empire toward instability, invited moral revolt, and laid the groundwork for Christianity's triumph. By turning desire into law, they hastened the death of the pagan empire and the birth of a new moral order. But the legacy of scandal is never fully buried. For in every age, rulers continue to blur the line between private vice and public power. And the echoes of Rome's forbidden emperors remind us just how dangerous that union can be. The story of Rome's most horrific emperors is not merely one of ancient debauchery. It is a reminder of what happens when the private desires of rulers become the law of nations, when the cravings of one man outweigh the morality of millions. From Caligula's humiliations of the Senate, to Elagabalus's desecration of Rome's sacred vows, to Nero's grotesque marriages and staged fantasies, each emperor revealed the same truth. Unchecked power corrupts not only the ruler, but the very society that bends to his will. These emperors turned intimacy into policy, scandal into governance, and taboo into law. And in doing so, they poisoned the empire from within. Their excesses may feel distant, dusty stories from a crumbling marble past, but echoes of Rome's scandals reverberate into our own time. Modern politics is not free from sex scandals, from leaders who manipulate intimacy for control, or from the spectacle of private vice turned public shame. We may no longer see emperors marrying castrated boys in torchlit ceremonies, but the principle remains the same. When leaders place personal desire above the common good, nations tremble. Even in our age of media and global scrutiny, rulers have fallen to the same trap as Caligula and Nero, believing their power to be limitless, their bodies untouchable, their fantasies beyond judgment. And just as in Rome, the audience watches, first with fascination, then with unease, and finally, with revolt. Yet many questions remain buried with Rome. How much of what we know was truth, and how much was rumor, sharpened by political enemies? Did Caligula truly plan to appoint his horse as consul? Or was it satire meant to mock his arrogance? Did Elagabalus sincerely wish to transform his body? Or was this a rumor born from cultural disgust? Did Nero really perform while Rome burned? Or was it a metaphor crafted by historians who despised him? What is certain is not the detail of every scandal, but the pattern: power corrupted by desire, and desire made into law. Whether exaggerated or not, The fact that Romans believed these tales speaks volumes about how they viewed their rulers and about the terror these emperors inspired. Rome's forbidden emperors remind us that scandal is not entertainment alone, it is a warning. A society that allows the lusts of its rulers to override its laws, its traditions, and its sacred values courts disaster. Rome's emperors pushed their empire to the edge, not through armies or taxes, but through the corruption of the most intimate human bonds. And so we return to the question, what happens when an emperor's desire becomes the law of the land? History has already given us the answer. It ends in rebellion, blood, and the collapse of worlds. The emperors are gone, their palaces reduced to ruins. But the warning remains, echoing through time. What other secrets lie buried in history's shadows, and how many of them are waiting to repeat themselves?